I'm Nat, if you have never been here before. I work at Exceptional Individuals. We are a social enterprise that supports neurodiverse individuals. And it just so happens that 80% of our team are neurodiverse. So lucky for you, you're in safe hands. April, who is my right-hand person, has autism as well as myself, but the way it presents itself in both of us is very different. So it shows you just how big the kind of spectrum scale is of it. Now, today we are going to do a bit of a deep dive, or to be fair, more of skimming the surface, just because it's such a dense subject on the psychology of autism. And the psychology, I think it's good to understand, what do we mean by psychology? It's a really academic term. It means a lot of things, but in a nutshell, it means the study of the human brain and human behavior. Why do we do what we do? Why? And how that relates to autism. Because autism is often seen as a very random condition, like, what are you doing there, mate? But there is a thought behind it, there is reason. And today we're going to look a little bit under the hood to see if we can start to understand why we act the way we act. But please remember, we're all individuals, so some of this may not apply to certain people in your life, but we're doing our best to cover a very broad subject in this amount of time. Oh, nice. Welcome, Phil from Dublin, who got recently diagnosed. Great to have you. Now, as I mentioned, we support people who are neurodiverse. We're based in the UK. We deliver workshops, training, audit, coaching, essentially anything A to Z to do with neurodiversity. And if you're new to the game, neurodiversity just means diversity of thought. But if we're talking about things like dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, ADHD, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, Tourette's, OCD, there's a lot of them, then we're talking about neurodivergent. If there was some of those names you've never heard of before, come back to one of our other webinars and we take a real deeper look in what do all of these names mean. So psychology of autism. Why do people with ASD think the way they think, act the way they act? The short answer is we don't really know. Autism is a very, very complex way of thinking and processing the world, but we do have a lot of theories. So today we're going to be looking at the top theories related to autism. And most of these theories come from like 70s, 90s. So they're cracking on a bit. And I will be telling you the pros and cons of them because they're not 100% foolproof just yet. Also, the reason why they're theories is that they're very, very difficult to prove, and you'll probably see why as we go along. But we are going to be recovering some research on social and communicative impairments in autism. I will apologise right now that today we are going to be using quite a lot of negative language, deficits, impairments, disabilities. Not my preferred language, but when we look at academic papers, that's the language they typically use. So to keep faithful to what they intended, that's why I'm going to be using that today. We're going to be looking at criteria for identifying autism. And apparently there's different things which people who have autism always have, and only those with autism have. But there's also some criteria that kind of blur the line. And we're also going to be briefly mentioning how those with Asperger's was a separate category, but now is part of the same diagnosis, ASD. We've got overlapping features in diagnosing schemes. So some of you may know, there's normally like a big old handbook that helps people diagnose autism, though there's different ones for where you live in the world. There's ones in the UK, ones in the US, there's other ones, but genuinely there's some things that we can all agree on. And one of the biggest theories we're going to look at today is theory of mind. That is a really big one. And we're also going to be looking at what's good about it, what's bad about it, and what needs a little bit more research. And lastly, the effects of a late diagnosis, because when we look at the research of autism, there's a fair amount on children, but not that much research on adults. And as we all know, adult autism is a lifelong condition. It does not go away. It stays with you because it is part of you. Hence why we're doing psychology, because it's how your brain thinks. All right. So a good old classic one, this was 1994, the Triad of Impairments. Sounds rather epic, also a little bit negative, impairments, but in a nutshell, these three things make up an autism diagnosis. There has been a few little revisions, but this is very well known, so it's definitely worth a mention. So the three things: social communication. Are you able to communicate with your peers using language that flows, people understand? Great. If you struggle with that, that's one tick on the possibly autistic side. Then social interactions. How are you with your body language? Are you able to kind of pick up on small things, eye contact? And then lastly, repetitive behavior. Now, repetitive behavior wasn't always part of the diagnosis, but then we realized that this was something that was very, very common in everyone who we deem to be autistic. So these three things together make up autism. And remember, today is about theories. So these aren't my opinions. These are theories that are very well known. But bear in mind that there's no definitive answer at the moment, or probably for quite some time. So I want to ask you, out of those three, which ones do you think are unique to autism? Because some of them can easily be kind of overlap with other conditions, but there are two which genuinely are seen as part of autism, through and through. So at the moment, we've got repetitive and stereotype behavior, social functioning. Okay, nice. And okay, they're coming in. We've got a lot of flux at the moment. So it is, in fact, social functioning and language communication. Those are two characteristics which are unique to autism. So there are things, other developmental difficulties that do overlap with autism, but those are the two which normally differentiate between the both. Repetitive behavior easily overlaps with a lot of others, Tourette's, OCD, ADHD. There's one called Fragile X syndrome. We'll probably talk about that another day, but a lot of those will have the repetitive behavior. But social functioning and language communication together are the kind of core of what makes autism autism. But I want to put it to you, because that we're looking at a very academic point of view, but from a more personal perspective, what do you think is the defining features in autism? Like if you were to say to just someone on the street and they said, what is autism to you? What would you say are the things that make it unique? Okay, the first one we got is sensory differences. Yes, a lot of people with autism experience the world in different ways, so it could be more sensitive to things like light and touch. I look and feel the world differently. That's really interesting. Just a note on that, there's no difference visibly in terms of someone who is autistic and not autistic, but maybe your body language can be very different. There is a correlation between posture and how you kind of present yourself as well, which I find quite interesting. Social complexities. Yeah, trying to get in a date, not the easiest. Social processing, living in a bubble, great during the pandemic, right? But not for the rest of the time. Emotional dysregulation. Sorry, highly dyslexic, but I'm in a safe place here. No person is the same, feeling alienated. Patricia says, strong sense of justice, injustice. Overall, sensory problems. Interestingly, that a lot of these do tend to be deficits, but one thing that we're a big supporter of at Exceptional Individuals is the neurodiversity movement related to autism, where yes, there are deficits, but also there are a lot of positives. So it's a fluctuation of ability. But it is interesting that when you think of the defining features, we often think of the things that someone is not able to do rather than the things they can do. But yeah, all of these things, they do overlap very, very heavily. And we're going to go in a little bit more detail about the social side and the language side of the challenges. Michaela says, driving is my autistic superpower. I wish that was mine. I'm terrible, but that's great. So what have we got here? So first of all, we've got use of eye gaze. And you can see that some of these overlap. And at first, it seems a relatively easy question. Is something a social deficit or is it a language deficit? And what's really the difference between the two of them? So use of eye gaze, facial expression, body posture and gesture are typically social deficits, and delay of spoken language, sustaining a conversation and spontaneous play could be a language deficit. But as you can see, they're a bit blurry, a lot of them. And this is another thing which makes it quite difficult to diagnose autism when you're kind of relating what connects to what. Some of these, as you can see, are pretty obvious. Delays of spoken language, well, it's in the name. Social deficit, well, spontaneous play, that is related to social. But then you could make the argument, well, maybe facial expressions and eye gaze is to do with social, but it is also a form of language. And that brings me nicely on to the next section on the overlaps. So for social, shares enjoyment and interest with others, and for communication, points to express interests. Those two things very similar, but yet they come from two parts of how the brain interacts and processes the world. And then we've got imaginative play with peers, and then imaginative play. They seem quite similar, but one is how you interact with yourself, and then the other is how you interact with the world around you. So yes, looks very similar, but also quite different. And the last one, interested in others. And then the other one is imitates social play. So you'll notice that a lot of people with autism will kind of mimic. We often call it masking, where you observe the outside world and you kind of mimic it in order to fit in with the rest of the world. Typically, kids do that very early on in order to develop and learn these, like the way of the world. But people with autism, it doesn't always feel quite natural, and yet they might continue to mimic and imitate. But it will always be extra pressure and stress and can lead to further anxiety. Is that why women are diagnosed later in life? Yeah, it is. A lot of the time, the reason why women are typically diagnosed later is a number of things. One, the way we diagnose people was pretty much created for men, white men at that. So it doesn't really represent the differences in how it presents itself in cultures, religions, races, any sort of background where there's going to be differences in how someone is raised or born or genetics, it is going to look a little bit different. And women typically they typically mask a lot more, just how it is really. So let's say, for example, a boy in a class might demonstrate some of their qualities in a disruptive manner, which means they're more likely to get support, where a girl might be more passive in how they demonstrate their autistic characteristics and not get help. Luke says, mimicking feels interesting to me because it feels like everyone in society tries to fit in to an extent. It is true, and we all do that. It's like a survival mechanism. If we are all the same, we're part of a clan. It's why we're not great at peace with other countries, because we always see them as the other, and for some reason people don't like difference. But hopefully we all know it is a great thing. Moving on to the big theory of mind. The ability of understanding and taking into account another's mental state or of mind reading. There's a lot of words here, but essentially mind reading. I'm sure your parents have said, you know what, I'm not a mind reader, but human beings kind of are mind readers. We're able to put ourselves in another person's shoes and act with that kind of knowledge. though people with autism typically find that a lot more difficult. So I want you to have a look at this image and write down, what do you think is inside this box? I know it might seem pretty simple, but trust me, there's a reason for why I'm asking this. We've got Smarties, sweets, chocolate. Oh, none of you got it right. The correct answer was pencils. Now, why did you get that wrong? You know, it's an interesting one, but when you think about it, it seems like obvious, but you saw a packet, it had Smarties written on it, so you just made that assessment that, well, it must be, without actually knowing physically what's in it. Trisha says, I would say packets of Smarties, but that's presuming that they are in packaging. Yeah. Is it because we take things literally? Yep, completely. Face value. Yeah, Trisha, that's exactly right. So people typically take things on face value. They don't kind of look deeper into it. And those with autism can typically struggle with this, you know, being able to make the assumption, taking the information, well, it's a box that has Smarties in, so presumably it will have Smarties in. But the truth is, we do not know. Unless we actually look inside of the box, we're not going to know. Ian says limited information and most likely, and it's the most logical explanation. Yep. This is how people like us end up getting exploited and abused, sadly. That is sadly the case.
What do you mean by exploited and abused?
Unfortunately, people with autism can be misled because they might not process the world in the same way as typical neurotypicals. It does mean that they're more prone to be exploited or might be considered vulnerable people in certain circumstances. And Anthony says there was no indication nor clues that there were any pencils in the box labeled Smarties. True. So you weren't able to mind read, essentially. You did not know. As we don't see easily others people's intentions and objectivities behind their actions. Yeah, exactly. So the false belief tasks show that it is possible to hold false beliefs. So you can believe something to be true, even though it is not true. And that is just part of this human existence on a day-to-day basis. We always hold beliefs we believe to be true. Like, for instance, you're looking at me as a flat image. You assume I'm real and I'm not like a computer, but you don't really know. And that's not a bad thing because we have to make assumptions, but it is interesting, isn't it? I mean, why people act like this way, that's a whole nother lesson on psychology. I want you to look at this, and some of you may be familiar with this task. This is the Sally Ann task, and this is a really famous way on how people are diagnosed or kind of looked to understand if they have theory of mind. So are they able to put their mind in someone else's mind and have an idea of what they're thinking rather than just from their own perspective? You could also call it empathy in some ways. So this is what they used to do with kids, and they would have like two little dolls, and you'd have one called Sally, and Sally would have her own basket, and then you would have Anne, and Anne has a box. So they have two different things. Sally comes along and she has this big red ball and she puts it in her basket. Anne has seen this. She's like, okay, I've seen that. Then Sally goes out of the room and leaves Anne alone. So currently, Anne is in the room on her own with the basket and the box. Sally, I don't know where Sally is at the moment, but she's not there. Anne then takes the ball out of the basket and she puts it in her box. Sally comes back and she wants to play with the ball. But where will Sally look for her ball? Is she going to look in the basket or is she going to look in the box? And I see that I put these pictures the wrong way round. So go with whatever the image is. Okay, interestingly, so most of you have put the basket, again, apologies for the dodgy confusion. Let's see, what do we actually want? So, sorry, it confuses me as well now. So Anne has taken the ball out and put it in the box. Now, when Sally comes back, will she look in the box? Now, I think it's like 80% of people with autism will look in the box. And that's because they have the information. They're able to like see between like the fourth wall, and they know where it went. But if you were to put like to have empathy for Sally, you would know that she wasn't there when the ball went into the box. So this is a really classic way of seeing if someone has theory of mind, if they're able to put themselves in someone else's position. So this is a classic test that people do when they're looking for autism, but it's not unique to autism, but a lot of people with autism do struggle with this test. Ian says, in one picture, there is a bump where the ball is. In the second, the cover is flat. Ball not in basket, likely in the box. Interesting. Anthony says, because if I was Sally, it's only natural that I would look there first. Did she see where the ball was put originally, or was it a guess? She just guessed, to be honest. She didn't see. On this task, the idea is that a lot of people who have autism, typically at a younger age, maybe not so much an adult age, but as a younger age, will not be able to guess where Sally will look for the ball. So Sally, because when she was last around, she put it in her basket. So when she comes back, she is going to look in her basket. But we, as the audience, knows that the ball is not in the basket. So the question typically is, for someone who might have autism, for instance, or under the age of 4, they're not able to put themselves in someone else's position. It proves that people are not born with awareness. It is something that we grow and we develop. So it proves again that autism, you're born with it, and it's something that you do not develop. That's why we normally call it a developmental disorder. But I just want to quickly demonstrate to say why this is a little bit problematic, because this test was 80% of people with autism failed it. But when they did a test years later with an incentive, so for instance, rather than a ball, they put a chocolate bar, and if the kid got it right, they got the chocolate bar, their results went up dramatically. So it showed a little bit that maybe autism isn't just about understanding one's place in the world and like empathy. Maybe it's also about incentive and what they find particularly interesting or have a drive to do. So take this test with a pinch of salt, because they didn't obviously look at all different factors and motivations when doing it. So Sonia says, yep, is it something that people with autism lack? Yes, it is. People with autism typically will lack the theory of mind, or it will be impaired. So the point to the basket is to understand that Sally has her own set of beliefs about the world that is different from your own. I think that's really important again. So just to really make it hopefully as simple as possible, the reason why this is interesting is that if you point to the basket, it understands that Sally has her own set of beliefs. So she doesn't share the same knowledge as us. So she isn't going to pick the same answer as us, because we both have different sets of information. But those with autism typically struggle with this question, and 80% of the time got it wrong. They show less activation in brain regions such as MPFC and TFP. I think they're not so important, but essentially there is proof about why this happens. Different parts of the brain are not lighting up. I think I'm going to sharply move on from this, because there's a lot of debate, and it's definitely worthwhile though. This is a deeper dive into the psychological model of autism, and this takes everything we've already spoken about and adds upon it. So we know we've got the triad of impairments, the kind of like 3 areas which kind of results in autism. So how we interact with the world, how we communicate with the world, So play, communication, social interaction. That could also be repetitive behavior. And you normally have your genetics, so how you were born, what's in your DNA. Then you have the brain mechanisms, how everything is working. And then you have the theory of mind on how the brain is processing that. And eventually that kind of falls into all the different areas. Yes, okay, we've got a great blog on theory of mind. Thank you. I'll definitely check that out. So now we know what the theory of mind is and the social deficits in autism. How do they exactly come together? How can we join them and get something meaningful out of it? Another example of how these two kind of connect is describing what a friend is. So just for an exercise, humor me on this, I just want you to write what a friend is. Because this is a task which someone who struggles with theory of mind or has challenges in social communication might struggle with. So individuals with autism can fail to appreciate that friendship goes beyond acquaintances / social interaction. It is a deeper connection based on sharing experiences and feelings. It requires a mentalistic view of the other person. So that's quite an interesting way. So they're saying that those with autism see things at face value. We've already mentioned that with the theory of mind and the box task. But if you were to take that core concept and apply it to the rest of life, you start to see how it can have a bigger impact. So even with something like friendship, why do people with autism struggle to make friends? It could be that they struggle to see deeper into things. So it's not just like you're someone being nice to me, I'm going to be nice to you back, but understanding that there's something deeper there. Some of you have said, someone you can trust, someone understands you, a mutual agreement with another person that you like each other and want to support each other. Someone who you get along with, shares interests with. My best friend is more like my sister. I don't know how to answer this. Someone who will accept you for who you are. But as you can see, there's a lot of ambiguity in what a friend is, and it's something which you just know. And those with autism don't just know it. It's something which doesn't come instinctively to them. So we are not saying that people with autism cannot have friends. They absolutely can. But what we're saying is it needs more thought and concentration, and they need to learn what it is. Because again, not mind readers, but whereas neurotypical people they find it easier to mind read in a way, autistic people aren't mind readers. And this is why things need to be typically a bit more black and white. We've got friends are people who you can trust and rely on for mutual support when needed and share interests and value. So yeah, really interesting. The next one I want to move on to. So we're just smashing through the theories at the moment to give you a good basic knowledge of why we think, maybe not why we know people are autistic, but what do we know that is different from people who are diagnosed with autism to those who are not diagnosed with autism. And the next thing is called the social world. So the social world, which is how we interpret the world, how we navigate it, how things make sense to us, relies on a couple of key criteria. So those with autism, you'll notice that a lot of us, we can struggle with how we navigate the world. Things don't make sense. Things seem confusing. But why is that? Well, psychologists were able to pinpoint it down to a few key points. Okay, well, on quicker, Sonia says, isn't it interesting that people with too much mind reading, often with over-accessibilities and those lacking or present similar behaviors within society, to point the former can be confused with? Yeah. Okay, so people, again, the social world, how we interpret the world, we need to know that people are intentional. So people are doing things for a reason. That's one of the first things we need to know. The second thing is that people's actions seem unpredictable. So yeah, we can act unpredictable, but are we unpredictable, or is that just part of who we are? Then routines reduce the unpredictability. So there are reasons we do things in a certain way. We aren't doing them just for the sake of doing them. We're doing them because there's a purpose behind them. Then we've got social interactions are more frequent with familiar faces, more predictable. So the reason why you hang out with people you are more familiar with is that you already have that bond. You always have that relationship. This is why you might choose to hang out with someone more frequently, i.e. make a friend. And a really good example of this is on the phone. So this image I quite like. So a dad phones up his son and he's like, oh, okay, mate, what are you doing? And the son is saying, I'm playing with this. Now to him, that's a perfectly fine answer. But what he's not able to do is put his dad's kind of like world into his world for a short amount of time, because his dad doesn't have the same information, the same beliefs as his son. So obviously he's not going to know he's playing with a train. So just let's apply this. So people are intentional. So what are you doing? So again, it is essentially mind reading, which I think is quite interesting, that people with autism struggle with putting themselves in someone else's shoes. There used to be this misunderstanding that those with autism are less empathetic and don't have empathy, but we know that's not true. People with autism can absolutely be empathetic, but there is a difference between our understanding of the world and how it works to being able to have an emotional connection with someone and have feelings to care about their feelings. You care about someone's feelings, but you might not necessarily be able to understand it or put yourself in their exact position. So we got another blog that criticizes this theory. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm not saying any of these are the most common theories that are currently in place. So on this, we're now going to move a little bit on to pronoun reversal error. And this definitely relates and is a follow-on from how we understand the world. But now we're going to be more focusing on verbal communication. So on here, I want you to look at these images of Maggie and Marge Simpson. And here it says, Maggie's mum is washing herself. And again, at first glance, seems like an easy thing to answer. But you've got to ask yourself, in order to answer this question, what information do you need? Well, you need to have a good grasp of the English language, and you need to be able to apply the right pronouns. So Maggie's mum is washing herself. Well, the first word I see is Maggie. So is it one of Maggie washing herself? No, Maggie's mum is washing herself. So we're on about Marge, obviously, because Maggie's mum is Marge. And it's because we're using two different terms, it can kind of confuse the brain. And a lot of people with autism, particularly at a young age, really struggle with pronouns. So I might say, Nathaniel, go do this, or, I might get things mixed up. And that can kind of continue into older life. Why? Well, again, it goes back to the key principles that we mentioned. So let's see. It goes back to these things on how we understand the world. And the world does have a set of instructions. So the way we have created language was created for a purpose in order to understand each other effectively. But yet those with autism might struggle with those set of rules. I think that we can detach from emotions because of feeling too much at a self-protective measure. Yeah, I could definitely feel that way. The next one is an example of metaphors. So we all know that people with autism can sometimes struggle with taking things very literally. And this all goes back to theory of mind, but today we're just really diving in deep for people to walk away with an understanding on what does it mean to lack a theory of mind. So I just want a couple of examples of a metaphor. Now, why is this relevant? So life is a roller coaster. Again, if you were to take this very literally, well, life is not a roller coaster. Life is me going about my day. A roller coaster is normally a metal thing. So yeah, it makes no sense. The world is my oyster. No, the world is a big whole rock floating around the universe. Breaking a leg, that's a bad thing. Why would I want to break a leg? And it's because you aren't taking all of the context into consideration. Well, okay, first of all, you need to know a context that in theatre, breaking a leg is considered good luck. You also need to know that people's intentions. Realistically, if I was to take all of this information, why would someone want me to hurt myself? No, they wouldn't. They're on my side. Then there's humour to take in consideration. So there's so many different things we need to understand about the world in order for this to make sense. Now, I'm not saying those with autism cannot figure these things out. They absolutely can. But what I'm saying is it takes a brain more time to process, to put these things together for it to flow. It's why maybe there can be a delay. It's also why sometimes different types of humour just don't really work. Because things that the human brain learns over time, the way the world works, those with autism will typically have a delayed response to learning those. Or if they are able to learn them, it's not going to come as fluidly. Okay, we got depressing me. I don't know if that's a metaphor. Breaking a leg, raining cats and dogs. I always used to struggle with that one. You smell like flowers. Nice, a storm, my thoughts. Okay, interesting. But yeah, hopefully you can see why people can struggle with these. Then, as well as metaphors, you also have things that are sarcastic, ironic, things which do not make sense. And there is a close relationship between understanding theory of mind and irony. So if you struggle with the theory of mind task, the chances are you are also going to struggle with irony. Okay, AB says, classic one that gets me is when I ask a bus driver or whoever for a ticket and they say no as a joke, and then I can get upset at first because how do I know? It's true. I hate when people do that and they're like, oh, do you mind if I have that? No. Like, I remember an ice cream man did that, said, oh, can I have the one with the flake? No. And it takes me a while because, okay, why are they doing that? You know, you can work it out, but it takes a lot more processes. So here we got a fire station burns down. Well, it's ironic because they're meant to put out fires. But if you do not know that they put out fires, it's just a statement. I don't see what the joke is. A police station get robbed. Why is that ironic? Well, again, you need to have different sets of information. And you need to be able to process those informations really quickly in order to get it. But in a general conversation, those with autism might not be able to put as much focus or energy into decoding different sentences. And as a result, the humor is lost. Yeah, these are really difficult. But hopefully you leave today with a bit of reassurance that there is a reason behind it. And it all goes back to the theory of mind. So though even today, the vast majority understood what basket or box the ball got put into, there still is a ripple into your entire life. And it might not be as obvious as not being able to understand what box is in what ball is in what box, but it can be something as more like minor, like metaphors or statements or irony. Yes, okay, great, you understand. The next one is this. So I just want you to rate yourself. We mentioned a few like metaphors and irony. If you don't know the difference, a metaphor is describing something using in another way. So like the moon is like a big ball of cheese. You know, it's not cheese, but it's a way of describing it to kind of bring it to life for you, where something that's ironic is ironic because I don't know how to describe that actually. It's saying something like it's funny because that's not how it should be. And they do say a lot of what makes jokes is that it tricks the brain because our brain expects things to work in a certain linear path. And if something kind of like upsets what we expect, that normally results in like the brain being confused and then it finds it funny. So humor is just about kind of navigating the brain and tripping it up if you can. So on here, I can see a lot of you rate yourself are quite good storytellers, sarcasm, terrible at lying, double bluffing, jokes. And all of these things are all very, very, very similar when it comes to understanding theory of mind and being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes and having an awareness of the world around you with the different principles. People with autism do struggle to lie because, again, if you think about lying, it does require you to manipulate a situation and for you to understand what the other person is likely to believe and what to go with. Or if someone is lying to you, how are you to know that they're lying? Well, it would require you to understand what they're thinking. What would they gain by lying? What do they hope to achieve? And again, we know how to lie. We can definitely understand when people are lying to us, but the amount of energy that can take can be like a massive burden. It's why when you're stressed or when you're under a lot of pressure, some of these things you can find even more difficult. So maybe on a normal day when you're feeling quite good, you might be able to know a lie between the truth, or you might know if someone's trying to be sarcastic. But if you've got a day when there's a lot going on, you might find these things a lot more difficult. It also explains why those with autism, it is a lifelong condition, but it might not always demonstrate itself in the same way. So some days you might be completely fine and other days you might really struggle. But to your peers, you're like, well, you got the joke the other day. Why aren't you understanding today? So it can be quite difficult for other people to understand. A bit ironic in a way that the deficit in being is putting yourself in someone else's shoes, but the world isn't able to put themselves in your shoes. So kind of classic example there. The Clefairy GIF is my life. Yes, I do love the Pokemon. But the last one is the landscape of consciousness. Sounds really epic. And this is, again, understanding someone else's emotions that are really unique. Because obviously we've got happy and we've got sad, but the spectrum is huge. So are you able to go down to the minute detail? So for those of you who are nerds, which hopefully a lot of you are, how did Luke feel when Darth Vader died? And this is, on the surface, fairly easy. Obviously, this is kind of expecting that a lot of you have seen Star Wars. So spoilers coming up. Bittersweet, sad, angry, conflicted, confused, really interesting. Like, these are all bitter. But imagine this. So you've never seen Star Wars. How did Luke feel when Darth Vader died? Well, Luke sounds like a normal person. Darth Vader, I think I know a little bit about him. I think he's a bad person. He probably felt happy he died. Or if he didn't know that he was a bad person, he felt sad that he died. But when we know the hidden context behind it, spoiler alert, it's his dad and he's evil, suddenly it gets a little bit confusing and we're really not sure how to respond. So this is a perfect example of theory of mind. It's that when you do not have all the information, it's very difficult in order to put yourself in someone else's shoes. It's not that you do not have empathy, it's that you aren't able to mind read. And mind reading is something we do to navigate the world as effectively as possible, but not being able to mind read doesn't make you less capable than anyone else. It just means that the way your brain prefers to process is it likes to have the information. It's more reliant on facts and figures and statistics and not taking guesswork. So autism doesn't have to be seen as a deficit. It needs to be seen as a different way of processing the world, where in certain situations, it can absolutely be a positive, but also it can be taken advantage of, which we mentioned today. I would say hard to describe. Darth Vader was Luke's father and Darth Vader was the main villain. Absolutely, April. It's confusing. So just to sum up with for the end of the day is that we do not know what autism really is or where it comes from. But what we do know is there's a lot of characteristics that appear in a lot of us. And then it mainly comes down to how we interpret the world with communication, both verbal and non-verbal. And understanding about why we struggle with communicating can help us in order to find shortcuts, solutions, tips and tricks, life hacks in navigating the world. I truly do not believe that autism is a disorder, in my personal opinion, but I do believe the world was created for those who do not have an autistic way of processing the world. So is it disability? In our current society, without adjustments, yes, it is. But is it inherently a disability? I would argue no, but I would love to know your thoughts on that. If any of you are autistic and in the workplace, I would say get in contact with exceptional individuals. Here, this just talks about the slide I always mentioned about getting support in the workplace. We're not trying to get rid of autism. In an ideal world, autism would still exist. But what we are saying, in an ideal world, people would have more awareness, more understanding, but also we do not live in an ideal world. So different support and strategies do need to be put in place. So I hope that's clear. If any of you have any questions, please put them down. Today, I know it's been a bit confusing. There's a lot to kind of take in here, but it's more about asking questions that might not necessarily have the right answers, but to always say, okay, if I'm struggling with this, if I'm finding that difficult, why is that? Is there something going on that can explain this or at least help me understand? And I think the more we understand, the less we feel broken or wrong, and the more we're able to accept ourselves for being ourselves. The next webinar is a deep dive into book Neurotribes. Now, Neurotribes, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's a great book on autism, and it allowed me to see it in a very positive way. Today, we talked about psychology. This book talks about real life scenarios. Now, the book is massive, okay? And I want you all to benefit from the learnings of this book without having to read it, because reading isn't for everyone. We don't have the time or the luxury. So I'm going to go over the key learnings about what they're saying in Neurotribes. The main thing is that what are the myths that we've always thought about autism? And also, what is the future of autism? Where is this trend going? You know, how will society look at it in the future? So definitely worth a look. And to get in contact with us, here's our lovely details. My name's been Nat, N-A-T. You can just message me at nat@accept.co.uk or at exceptionalindividuals.com. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed today. Nice, got a jump, already booked my ticket. Yes, that's what we like to see. This was a difficult one for me because a lot of big words, but thanks for bearing with me and really hope to see you at the next one.
Nat,
and keep learning. Yeah.
Sorry, before you go, I wrote that question about energy accounting. Is it something that if I speak to your company, they might be able to help with? Or
yeah, no, absolutely. So we offer free coaching and mentoring like around those issues. So I can either give you like the general answer, or they can help you on a personal level on how to figure it out for yourself.
Yeah, okay. I will send an email then and hopefully get in touch with somebody.
Yeah, if you include me as well, I'll definitely answer it. Just because we get hundreds of emails. Mine's just Nat, N-A-T @exceptionalindividuals.com.
At exceptionalindividuals.com. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Cool, no, thank you. All right, we'll have a great rest of your day and see you soon.